Me at St. Mary's Church. The church is packed with worshippers who are paying their respects. And we are also getting reports that the Polish government is meeting in emergency session tonight to discuss the official period of mourning and its impact on Poland and how Poles will be marking this period of mourning.
And we've been hearing the Polish president, Mr. Kwasniewski, speaking about the Pope, saying that without him, Poland would not be free of communism.
Yes, and that's time and time again. That's the message really that you get from many Polish people here talking about the Pope and the important role that he played, crediting him with bringing about or helping to bring about the fall of communism, the fact that he inspired the Solidarity movement. He came here to Poland in 1979, just a year after he was elected Pope. And it was here in Krakow that on that occasion he said to Polish people, do not be afraid.
And what do you think Poland will do now? How will they come to terms with the death of the Polish Pope?
Well, this is a very difficult time for this deeply Catholic nation of around 35 million Catholics here in this country. And just talking to some people this evening, they were lost for words. They burst into tears when you even mentioned the Pope's name. So I think this is going to take a few more days for people really to appreciate the news that they're just getting this evening. And this will be a period of mourning for the whole country.
Dana Moore, thank you very much indeed. There have been tributes paid to the Pope by many world leaders, even in the short time since his death. President George Bush had this statement to make.
The Catholic Church has lost its shepherd. The world has lost a champion of human freedom. And a good and faithful servant of God has been called home. Pope John Paul II left the throne of St. Peter in the same way he ascended to it, as a witness to the dignity of human life.
And one of the places where the Pope took the Catholic Church was to Latin America. It's now the Latin American Cardinals, I suppose you could say the largest bloc in the College of Cardinals, an indication of their importance and the importance of Latin America in the Catholic Church. Steve Kingston is on a video phone from Sao Paulo in Brazil. Steve, how are people there taking the news?
Well, it was very interesting. When the news came through, there was actually a mass taking place in the cathedral behind me here in the center of Sao Paulo. The Cardinal Archbishop of Sao Paulo, Claudio Gomez, has been describing this Pope as one of the greatest popes of all time, perhaps the greatest of the past 100 years. He didn't receive the news of the death during the Mass, so people only heard that news when they came out, and it is still sinking in. Many people coming out feeling a great sense of sadness. Some of the people we spoke to were crying. From the President of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, statement in the past few minutes. He says, the people of Brazil, the biggest Roman Catholic country in the world, are profoundly saddened by the death of John Paul II. His 3 visits here will always be remembered with strong emotion. He carried out his mission with energy and clarity. The suffering, which he didn't hide in his later years, never weakened his determination.
And Steve, the Pope's approach to Latin America was extremely robust, wasn't it? He used to call them to order to make sure that the theology developed there didn't stray away from the main Catholic line.
That's right. When this Pope took office, Latin America was deeply polarized between, on the one side, right-wing military-backed dictatorships across much of the region, and on the other side, Marxist guerrilla forces that in many cases were waging revolutionary wars against those dictatorships. And there are plenty of people here who feel that the Pope should have intervened on the side of the political left at that time, and they've never forgiven him for distancing the Church from that particular fight at that particular time. Now, what's being stressed by the Pope's supporters now is that he did care very deeply about Brazilian issues. It's inequality, economic inequality, that still really scars this country and this continent, and it's being stressed that whenever the Pope came here, he wanted to speak to Brazil's homeless, Brazil's indigenous populations, and Brazil's urban poor, that he really wanted to understand, share, and help solve their suffering.
Sao Paulo, Brazil. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Pope John Paul II was the third longest serving pope in history. Only St. Peter and one other pope took a longer period in office than he did, just over 26 years as the reigning leader of the Roman Catholic Church. Andrew Burrows looks back now on his life and his pontificate.
He was the first Slavic pope in history, the first non-Italian for 450 years, and the youngest pontiff for a century. His charisma made him the first papal superstar, taking his message around the world. He was staunchly conservative on theology and morals, strengthening the Church's opposition to women priests, contraception and abortion.
No one ever has the authority to destroy unborn life.
Karol Wojtyła grew up in southern Poland, the son of an army sergeant. His mother and brother died before he was 14. After the outbreak of World War II, he studied for the priesthood. In the 1960s, as Archbishop of Krakow, he gained popularity, pressuring the communist authorities to allow a church in the steel town of Nowa Huta. It was built like a ship, one that launched him as a papal candidate. His support for human rights and Poland's Solidarity trade union shook the communist world. There were risks. The attempt on his life in 1981 raised suspicions of Bulgarian Secret Service and KGB involvement. After a remarkable recovery, he offered forgiveness to his Turkish would-be assassin, Ali Aca. The Pope out-travelled all previous pontiffs, visiting scores of countries. In the developing world, his insistence on papal authority was welcomed, just as it was resented by liberal Westerners. He kept 2 of his 9 Pope-mobiles in South America, where left-wing liberation theology was popular. He believed it resembled communism, and he personally rebuked its leaders. His travels took him to Ireland, where a 1 million-strong congregation heard his plea for peace.
On my knees, I beg you to turn away from the path of violence and to return to the ways of peace.
At Canterbury, a historic encounter with Archbishop Robert Runcie failed to bring joint Anglican-Catholic communion services closer, the Pope opposing reunion with any church which ordained women. Inside the world's smallest state, the Pope made sweeping changes, de-Italianizing the Vatican. Under the staunchly conservative Cardinal Ratzinger, head of doctrine, a liberation theologian would be sentenced to a year's silence, a liberal professor stripped of his ecclesiastical license, a conservative bishop appointed against local wishes. The Vatican faced the scandal of paedophile priests. As victims spoke out, cardinals from America accused of shielding the guilty were summoned to a papal lecture. Under Pope John Paul, critics bemoaned the reversal of reforms of the 1960s aimed at making the Church more open to the world. But he believed it was the world which should conform to the Church to receive salvation.
The mission of salvation, that is the mission of the Church. And this mission is still actual, is still of today and of tomorrow.
As old age and disease took their grip, the Pope embarked on a mission of reconciliation for the new millennium. In Athens, he braved black flags of protest to offer peace to Orthodox leaders, apologizing for past Catholic wrongs against the Greek Church. And he became the first Pope to enter a Muslim prayer hall, visiting the tomb of St. John the Baptist, which today lies inside a Syrian mosque. The Pope chose the celebrations of 25 years of his papacy for one of his most popular decrees, beatifying Mother Teresa of Calcutta, bestowing this step towards sainthood just 6 years after her death. She will join a record number of saints that Pope John Paul leaves behind. All provide modern role models for today's Catholics to pray to. His papacy drew many lines he believed the Church should not cross. But above all, Pope John Paul II gave Catholics back their confidence in who they are and what they stand for.
This Pope has been an extraordinary figure, both spiritually and temporally, bringing the Roman Catholic Church into the heart of world politics, as well as setting it new directions internally and sometimes arousing great controversy with the way in which he's brought it forward. Father Gerald O'Collins from the Gregorian University here in Rome has seen that entire papacy, has seen these many changes that have been brought about. Father Gerald, what's your personal reflection now when you look back on these 26 years?
I'm very fond of him and very grateful to him. And I love the way he reached out to the poor people of Africa. The last batch of cardinals, he made the Archbishop of Khartoum in Sudan a cardinal to kind of strengthen his hand in a very bad situation. Then another cardinal he made in that same batch was from Cape Coast, down on the west side of Africa. That was a great centre of the slave trade. And these were things that had his fingerprints all over them. John Paul II was a great battler and supporter of those who suffered.
And he widened the Pope, widened the church, widened the range of the church, didn't he?
Well, he was a great friend of Africa. Africa's grown enormously, the Catholic population there, and 2/3 of the Catholic Church come from the developing world now, and he was I think they should put up a gigantic statue to him in Africa. He was a colossus. I have to think in terms of William Shakespeare, actually, to get some measure on him in my imagination. And I think of what Shakespeare said about Julius Caesar. He hath bestrode the narrow world like a colossus. And the world was his parish, and particularly Africa.
And now he's gone, and down below us at St. Peter's Square, the ceremonies which begin the marking of his death are well underway.
They will, and they'll have a book of the Gospels out there in front of the altar at the Mass, presumably on Wednesday afternoon. And
this is the funeral Mass, you're saying?
Funeral Mass, and that'll be a sign of how he tried to live by the Scriptures. He tried to be faithful to his master. And of course there's a shadow side to every papacy, as there was with the life and work of St. Peter. St. Peter was a great and generous person, learnt on the job, but there's a shadow side to him as well. And Peter is a wonderful model that way, and there were lights and shadows in this papacy, but he battled on. He tried to live according to the Scriptures and do his best, especially for the people who had no voice in our world.
Let us, for a moment, just watch the scenes in St. Peter's Square, where people are praying now for the soul of the Pope.
Il Signore sia con voi. Dal Vangelo secondo Giovanni.
Gloria a te, o Signore.
La sera di quello stesso giorno, il primo dopo il sabato, mentre erano chiuse le porte del luogo dove si trovavano i discepoli per timore dei giudei, venne Gesù. Si fermò in mezzo a loro e disse: pace a voi. Detto questo, mostrò loro le mani e il costato. E i discepoli gioirono al vedere il Signore. Gesù disse loro di nuovo: pace a voi. Come il Padre ha mandato me,
as my Father sent me, so I send you.
Dopo aver detto questo,
after having said these words,
loro e disse:
he said to them,
ricevete lo Spirito Santo.
Receive the Holy Spirit.
I peccati saranno rimessi.
The sinners will be forgiven,
non
and those who do not
Tommaso,
give their sins will not.
12,
Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. And so the other disciples said to him, we have seen the Lord. But he said to them, if I don't see the sign, the marks of the nails in his hands, and I don't put my finger in the place where the nails went, and I don't put my hands in his ribs, until then I will not believe. 8 days later, the disciples were once again gathered in the house, and Thomas was there with them. Jesus came. With the doors closed, he stopped amongst them and he said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and look at my hands. Stretch your hand out and put it here on my ribs. And do not be an unbeliever, but believe now." And Thomas replied, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him,
The first of what will be very many ceremonies held here in St. Peter's over the next few days before the funeral mass itself, which we are told will probably be on Wednesday, although that hasn't yet been officially confirmed. Father Gerald Collins is still with me. You were telling me your remembrance of his first words when he was here. A very inclusive Pope, you thought.
Very inclusive language. His very first words were, "My brothers and sisters." And he was reaching out to women as well as men. That wasn't usual in Italy then. You just say fratelli, brothers. But no, fratelli et sorelle, brothers and sisters. And then, of course, he reached out to the Roman public saying, "Please correct me if I make a mistake in our language." They took him to their heart then.
As indeed much of the Church did, despite the fact that sometimes they were heavily at odds with the doctrines that he pressed on them.
Well, I mean, he stood up for things. I mean, if you don't stand up for something, you're going to fall for anything, as somebody said. And it was quite clear what he stood for life, against war, for forgiveness. Even before he became Pope, he had a big hand in 1965 in the Polish bishops reaching out to the Germans and being reconciled with them. There were some marvelous policies that were there with him all his life. Anti-Semitism he thought was just absurd. He grew up a little Jewish boy, he's played soccer with them against the Catholics. And anti-Semitism, he just couldn't understand that.
Father Collins, thank you very much indeed. Well, Father Collins there was talking about his origins in Poland. It was in Poland that he first really came to attention when he confronted quite regularly the communist authorities. And then when he became Pope, one of his first visits was back to Poland, back there to encourage the Polish people in their eventual revolt against communism and the growth of the Solidarity trade union movement. Angus Roxburgh, our correspondent in that region at the time, looks back at the Polish relationship.
In 1979, a year after being elected, the Polish Pope returned home to start a revolution. Millions turned out to see him wherever he went. No communist country had ever seen anything like it.
Maluchy ze mną tak kiwały.
John Paul did nothing so crude as to criticize the authorities. He merely gave the people a sense of moral superiority and hope. Solidarity was the communist bloc's first free trade union, set up in the heat of strikes led by Lech Wałęsa at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk. Inspired by the Polish Pope, they humiliated the government.
Ojciec Święty
The Holy Father brought back moral values, and they defeated the communist system. The communists were as frightened of those values as the devil is of holy water. So the Pope is the author of the victory over communism.
Wałęsa signed the document recognizing Solidarity with an outsized souvenir Pope pen. The truce with the communists was fragile and Solidarity was soon banned. But even the man who imposed martial law to squash it understood that the Pope's influence had lit a flame that could not be doused again.
Of course, the social and economic conditions were ripe for a protest, but the Pope in his teachings served as a detonator who liberated the spirit of society and gave it strength.
In 1987, on his third visit to Poland, the Pope prayed at the Gdansk monument to workers killed by the communist regime. Now he seemed to take a conscious step from the pulpit into the political arena. Celebrating Mass before a crowd of 750,000, he told them there is no struggle more effective than solidarity. Now the scene was set for revolution, not just in Poland, but all over Eastern Europe. The sense of inner freedom inspired by the Pope here was spreading throughout the communist bloc, and with a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, simultaneously loosening the chains, it was only a matter of time before the people would break free. At the end of 1989, Gorbachev went to the Vatican for a historic meeting between the man who nudged Eastern Europe towards freedom and the man who let them go. It set the seal on a year, indeed a decade, of change in the communist bloc. Free elections in Poland, won overwhelmingly by Solidarity, started a chain reaction which ended with the dismantling of the Berlin Wall. Doubtless it would all have happened eventually anyway, but without the Polish Pope, it might have taken much longer.
Angus Roxburgh reporting there. Now, this was a pope who spanned the continents. We've already heard how much impact he had in Africa, but there was also a great impact in Latin America too. Mexico City was one of the first places he visited after he took up the papacy. Claire Marshall joins us from there now. Claire, what's the atmosphere? How are people responding?
People are terribly upset, Brian. I'm here in front of the Basilica of the Virgin of Guadalupe. The Pope visited this holy site 4 times. As you say, this was the first place he came to after he was made Pope in 1979. People here hold him in great affection. This basilica is Latin America's version of the Virgin Mary. It honours her, and the Pope paid tribute to her when he came here during his 5 trips. There's already people starting to flock here as the news filters out across Mexico. There's some 200 to 300 people who've lit candles beneath a huge bronze statue of the Pope. Lots of people crying, many flowers have been laid. One person told me it was a great pain to lose him. When he came before, he gave me great peace. I feel like it's losing a father. Another person said he was such a strong spiritual leader. The world is a worse place. So certainly people here feeling the pain of the loss of the Pope. When the Pope came here on his last visit in 2002, they embraced him as their own. They called him a Mexican. They actually chanted this. The Pope, our brother, you are Mexican. He responded with a great warmth and said, yes, I do feel Mexican. So certainly the people here of Mexico greatly mourning the loss of the Pope.
And he emphasized the importance of Latin America in the church, creating many cardinals. I think they are now the largest single group of cardinals in the college.
Yes, you're exactly right, and certainly this does reflect the fact that now the half of the world's Catholics do live in Latin America. There are a couple of cardinals here who many people believe could be possibly likely successors, one here in Mexico City, another in Brazil, and another in Honduras. So certainly he embraced Latin America really for the first time. Certainly when he came here in 1979, he really helped thaw the relationship between the church and the state, which had been extremely bitter for more than 100 years. Most of all, he wanted to communicate with the people. Since the 1850s, the Roman Catholic Church here had actually no legal status. It was the Pope's visits here over the last 20-odd years that helped thaw this relationship and make it once more open. As the rector of the Basilica of the Virgin of Guadalupe said to me, he won the heart of Mexico, and Mexico the heart of the Pope. His visits here made politicians at last express their convictions openly. He called this place the continent of hope. So certainly Latin America, and particularly Mexico, held a great place of affection in the Pope's heart.
Claire Marshall in Mexico City, thank you very much. Well, here at the Vatican, there is a mood of reflection and some sadness. During the earlier part of the day, people didn't appear to be that saddened by the news that the Pope was declining. But tonight the morning has started. There is a Mass underway in St. Peter's Square.
O Signore, la nostra preghiera sia di aiuto alle anime dei fedeli defunti.
The souls
La
of
tua misericordia conceda
dead
loro
souls,
il perdono
let
dei
your
peccati
mercy
e li
forgive them
renda
their sins
partecipi della tua redenzione
and
per Cristo,
include them in your redemption for Christ our Lord.
It was here in the square that the first public announcement was made of the death of the Pope. The Archbishop who announced it said, "The Holy Father has returned to the house of the Father. We all feel like orphans this evening." That announcement was the first time that anyone had heard outside the papal household of what was happening, although during the day, of course, they had been receiving news of just how serious the Pope's condition was. But it was a deliberate attempt, I think, to prepare the way for this news. Many cardinals who visited him came out and commented that the Pope was now in his last hours, that he was close to death, that they didn't expect him to last very much longer. And then this evening, Vatican TV said, "The angels welcome you," after the formal announcement came from the Vatican spokesman.
Nel ricordo del Padre comune, con la disponibilità davanti al Signore,
before the Lord who judges our hearts, with the goodwill to break all connections with sin, every sentiment of envy or jealousy or hatred or revenge, with the readiness to re-establish peaceful links and solidarity with the name of the Lord and the very sweet memory of our Pope John Paul II. Brothers and sisters, let us exchange that gift of peace.
And there will be many more tributes to follow over the days to come before the funeral mass itself, which we believe will be on Wednesday. That is as early as it is possible to have the funeral mass under the timetable laid down by the Pope himself for the way events are to be ordained after his death. Adam Brooks is in Washington. Adam, we've already heard George Bush, within minutes of the announcement of the death, stepping out to make a remarkable tribute to him, an indication of just how important he was regarded, not just in the spiritual world, but in the temporal world too.
Yeah, Brian, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, George Bush made his way to the microphone in the White House with Laura Bush at his side very, very quickly, less than an hour after the announcement came out of the Vatican of the Pope's death. And he called Pope John Paul II a hero for the ages. I mean, that's a sign of just what historic significance the papacy of John Paul II is being accorded in the minds of many of America's leaders. He said the Catholic Church has lost its shepherd and the world has lost a champion of human freedom. That, of course, is a reference to the way that Pope John Paul was celebrated in America, particularly for his role in inspiring the movements in Poland that sparked the fall of communism all across Eastern Europe and then in the Soviet Union himself. He was held in very, very high regard in America for that reason. And there are other little clues in President Bush's speech which give you a sense of the commonalities between Pope John Paul and President Bush himself, and particularly religious conservatives in America, both Catholic and Protestant evangelical. President Bush noted that the Pope had urged Catholics to preserve, to build a culture of life. And that, of course, is a reference to Pope John Paul's opposition to abortion and to contraception. And his views on abstinence, and I think also on homosexuality too. And of course, many of these views are shared across the conservative spectrum in the United States. I think it's fair to say that Pope John Paul is really seen, particularly by conservative religious figures in the United States, as a great uniter of Christians ecumenically across Catholicism and across evangelical Protestantism too. And all those elements were present in the short eulogy that President Bush gave today.
Adam Brooks in Washington, thank you. And there we have one aspect of a highly complicated personality, a man who set great doctrinal positions for the Catholic Church, who intervened in the affairs of state around the world, will be remembered probably most for two things outside his own church sphere. One, the intervention in Eastern Europe and its hastening of the decline of communism, and the other, the great reaching out to other faiths, which happened under his watch in the Catholic Church. First to Judaism, and then an attempt to start a dialogue with Islam, which is still in its first stages, but will almost certainly be one of the things that the Church will want his successor to be particularly well placed to carry forward. In the square of St. Peter's, people are applauding, a way of showing their feelings, a way of expressing the emotion of this night, just a couple of hours after the announcement of the death of Pope John Paul II. And now we return to London.
Brian Hanrahan, you're watching BBC News 24 with continuing coverage on the evening of the death of Pope John Paul II. We've just had some report in from the Vatican saying that the Pope's final hours were marked by uninterrupted prayer. In St. Peter's Square, as was shown there when Brian was there, there's clapping now. On the whole, apart from small children, it's clapping without smiling. They're paying tribute to the Pope, but all through the evening, as the cameras have zoomed in on the up to 100,000 pilgrims now in St. Peter's Square, they've shown tears and solemnity as people have looked up to the windows of the papal apartments, where the Pope died exactly to the minute 3 hours ago.
Yes, police estimate at least 100,000 now in St. Peter's Square, and they expect many more pilgrims from around the world to head to Vatican City in the coming days. And there, the cameras showing the third-floor apartments of the Pope. We're just hearing from the Vatican that the Pope's body will lay in state in the Vatican Basilica no earlier than Monday. Of course, we're now into a period when events are dictated very much by pre-written church rules. The pontiff's mourning rites will last 9 days, and his body is expected to be laid to rest in the crypt underneath St. Peter's Basilica. And Italy has announced 3 days of national mourning. And we're also hearing that the cardinals are to meet on Monday at 10 a.m. local time. That is 9 o'clock our time.
Looking at the faces of the pilgrims, one hardly needs words. The faces say it all, don't they? It's been a long day. It's been a long evening. Our correspondent Ben Gagan reports on today's events in Rome.
All day they had gathered in their thousands in St. Peter's Square. They knew the end was close, that the man who had led their prayers in this place for so many years would never do so again.
Gloria Patri et Filio.
And then, as their candlelit vigil was underway, the news came in an email from his spokesman that Pope John Paul II had died at 23 minutes to 10 local time.
Dear brothers and sisters, at 21:37, our much beloved Holy Father John Paul II returned to the home of his father, and we pray for him.
The crowd, who'd been praying in the square since early evening, then applauded and went quiet. The moment had come. The Pope's suffering, which had been so public and had lasted so long, was over. The news was confirmed by the slow tolling of the cathedral bells across the Vatican City. The Italian government has announced 3 days of national mourning. Tonight, officials will start to empty the Pope's apartment in the Vatican, which will then be sealed. The gold ring of St. Peter will be taken off his finger and broken. all according to centuries-old tradition. The process of finding a successor will soon be underway. Ben Gagan, BBC News.
The leader of the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, appeared on the steps of Westminster Cathedral in central London shortly after the announcement to pay his tribute. Westminster Cathedral will remain open all night. Around the world, over 1 billion Catholics are now in mourning. Matthew Charles reports on international reactions.
The news, when it came, confirmed what pilgrims gathered in St. Peter's Square knew they would hear. There was silence, private thoughts, tears, but then also this. Appreciation shown for a pope who's inspired and guided the thinking of the Church for more than 2.5 decades. Even to the end, he maintained a determination to discharge his duties to the Catholic community of 1 billion souls. The lights in his private apartment still burning. Tributes are flooding in from across the globe. In the United States, President Bush gave his reaction to the news.
The Catholic Church has lost its shepherd. The world has lost a champion of human freedom. And a good and faithful servant of God has been called home.
The leader of the Catholic Church in England and Wales also paid tribute.
We'll remember him for his endurance of suffering, even to the very end. And we'll remember him, and I think the whole world should remember him, for reminding us tirelessly that this world is not the only world, that there's a world to come, our eternal destiny.
Nowhere will the loss be felt more keenly than in his native Poland. He was Archbishop of Krakow before being appointed Pope, the first non-Italian in that position for more than 4 centuries.
We used to think about Pope as a member of the family, and it's always said if a person so close dies.
After days of medical bulletins charting the decline of the Pope's health, it is now time for those who'd gathered to support the Pontiff in his final moments to consider the future of a church without him. Matthew Charles, BBC News.
Well, around the world, 1.1 billion Catholics are mourning the Pope. Let's go to our correspondent Clarence Mitchell. He's at Westminster Cathedral in London. Clarence, what was the mood there as the news filtered through?
Well, the mood, as you might well expect, was one of great sadness, great solemnity. Of course, hundreds of Catholics, indeed not just Catholics, but Christians and people of all faiths in many cases, had been coming here to the cathedral through the day for the regular masses that are always taking place here. But when the news came through shortly before 9 o'clock London time of the Pope's death, a bell began to ring here in the great tower of the cathedral. That rang for a full hour to tell formally the Diocese of Westminster the news, and of course the much wider Catholic community beyond across the UK. The papal flag was also raised to half-mast. It's still flying at half-mast above the entrance here, and the cathedral will be staying open all night for worshippers to come in to pray. There are, I would say, at least 100 or so. Excuse me, I'm being interrupted. There are at least 100 or so still in there praying, some of them in tears, some of them very quietly just saying their prayers by themselves in small groups, many lighting candles in front of a very large picture of the Pope by the altar. Later tomorrow morning, a full Requiem Mass will be held here, attended by probably over 1,000 people. And then on Monday, Vespers for the dead will be said for the Pope before the Cardinal himself. The Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, heads for Rome to attend the Pope's funeral and to take part in the conclave, which will, of course, elect the Pope's eventual successor.
Clarence, we did earlier hear from Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor. Tell us what he had to say in his tribute.
Well, it was a very moving and dignified tribute. He came out within moments of the news becoming public. That was always agreed that he would come and speak to the reporters who've been outside the cathedral. He didn't take questions, but he said that the world had lost, the modern world had lost one of its great leaders. He paid tribute to the Pope's tireless witness to freedom, he said, to the dignity of human life. He said that the Catholic Church would miss him, the world would miss him, and indeed he, as a man, would miss Pope John Paul. And he said, may he rest in peace, before returning to the cathedral. This clearly is a very solemn and sad night for Catholics, the wider Christian community, but in many ways as well, there is an air of celebration here. Not a celebration in the normal party sense of it, of course, but one of a life that was so full and so well led and meant so much to so many different people in so many different ways, that now is the time to, yes, be sad for the passing of the man's physical body, but to take comfort in the fact that his spirit and what he achieved will live on in the hearts of many people here.
Clarence, thank you.
Well, the latest word from the Vatican is that the Pope's body is expected to be brought to St. Peter's Basilica no earlier than Monday afternoon. The cardinals are expected to meet for the first time on Monday morning. No absolute confirmation yet of the date of the funeral, but it needs to be between 4 and 6 days after the death of the Pope. Well, with me is the BBC's former religious correspondent, Alex Kirby. Alex, is it too soon, frankly, to assess how great a Pope he was?
It's too soon to reach a balanced, rounded assessment, but I think obviously you can start doing so. I mean, the thing he's really going to be remembered for, above all, I think, is that papal fist that smashed through the Iron Curtain and brought the Soviet Union down. That is going to stay in a lot of people's memories. I think on the other side of the scales, people are going to say, well, had he taken a different line about the many child abuse scandals that have disfigured the church in different countries, then things could have been different if he'd concentrated on the victims, if he concentrated on the problems within the church rather than saying, well, it's because society is decadent. That could have made a difference.
I guess he couldn't do both. He couldn't be travelling the world in the way that he was and concentrating on running the church at home.
Well, his critics say that he could, you see. His critics say that it's a question of priorities, and he was his own man sufficiently to do what he wanted, but he didn't give as much priority as they would have liked to child abuse. Also, of course, the whole question of artificial birth control, of the use of condoms. They say many people could have been spared HIV/AIDS had he taken a different line and relaxed the prohibition on the use of condoms. So these are going to be factors.
Also accused of being very authoritarian too.
He was a centralised.
But I guess if you're a leader, you have to be at times.
Well, yes, except that the Second Vatican Council, which was held 40 years ago, had been intended to move the church away from that, moving power out to the bishops. He instead brought power and decision-making back to the Vatican, and that wasn't popular with a number of the bishops themselves.
And yet, you look at the faces of the people in St. Peter's Square tonight, and you multiply that face there by a billion and more, because we're talking beyond the Catholic community, aren't we?
Oh, certainly we are. And he was a complex person, and I think you have to allow that in some ways, politically, he didn't please everyone, but personally, he probably did please everyone he met, and millions who never met him, because he had this magnetism, this way of reaching out to people. And I think that, in some people's view, set aside any political reservations they might have had about him.
There was a bit of showbiz in him, wasn't there? I mean, he was a bit of a playwright, a bit of an actor as a young man. He cultivated the media. He knew how to use the media.
He knew how to work a crowd, yes. He was very good at it. But you didn't think, here is someone who is doing this, who is working this, who is using the media for purely pragmatic ends. You thought, here's a person who likes people, who is interested in people, who loves people, and who reaches out to them. And that's why he did it, I think.
I know he created more saints than any other pope. I think he created more saints than every other pope put together. And also, presumably, most of the cardinals in place now were appointed by him, or many of them. Does that mean that his legacy is certain to live on?
It means that many of the cardinals, as you say, were created by him and are to some degree following in his footsteps. But generally, cardinals seem to vote for someone who's different from the pope they've just had. So you get a conservative following a more liberal pope and vice versa. I don't think we should expect that the cardinals are necessarily going to vote exactly the way he himself would have voted. And remember, of the last 4 popes, 3 of them have been surprises. They do say that anyone who goes into the conclave as a pope comes out as a cardinal. In other words, if you're a favourite, you're not going to get very far. The other saying is the cardinal with the fewest enemies is the one who emerges as pope. I don't know whether that's true, but I think we should be prepared for surprises and not expect to see a clone of John Paul II. Necessarily.
Does that mean that we might go back to another Italian, even though the number of, I think I might say, the number of Italian cardinals is steadily shrinking?
Yes, it is, and a lot of them are, or some of them are over 80, so won't be eligible to vote. We may see another Italian. They might do something really radical and imaginative and appoint a third world cardinal, someone who can reach out to Islam. But I don't think the cardinals in the conclave are going to be saying we need someone who's going to be symbolic of the developing world or Italy or whatever it is. They're going to be looking at what the Pope, the new Pope, will do rather than any sort of symbolism, tokenism he might represent.
Might they want a Pope who's rather older? Maybe how would they fancy another papacy of 26 years?
They wouldn't, I think, is the answer. Yes, I think they want someone older than 58, which John Paul was when he became Pope. On the other hand, they don't want someone too old unless they're going for a purely transitional, not rocking the boat, safe pair of hands idea. Whoever they choose, though, is going to have a legacy from this Pope that is going to take a lot of sorting out, because there are all sorts of questions the Church is facing: falling congregations, falling numbers of priests in seminaries, more and more people in countries like Britain, Ireland, the United States, who feel that religion doesn't have the hold that it used to. So there are some tough decisions ahead for the Church and for the person chosen to lead it.
So to go back to the start of our conversation, it clearly is too soon to say that he was a great Pope with all those problems that he leaves behind.
He was a great Pope who did great things, who was a great man and a force for good. But that is not the whole picture, and he does leave to his successor a lot of clearing up to do. Inevitably, probably, any Pope would do, but we shouldn't say that whoever takes over from John Paul II is going to have an easy time, because I don't think they will.
OK, Alex, thanks very much indeed.
And these are live pictures coming to us from St. Peter's Square in Vatican City, where tens of thousands of mourners are now gathered. Police estimate at least 100,000 mourners gathered there. And we're hearing from the Vatican tonight that the body of Pope John Paul II will lay in state for public viewing in St. Peter's Basilica from Monday afternoon at the earliest. And we also hear in a statement from the Vatican that the Pope received the Roman Catholic sacrament reserved for the sick and dying before he passed away a little earlier this evening in his Vatican apartment. His final hours, the Vatican has said, were marked by uninterrupted prayer. Well, Pope John Paul II was the most travelled pontiff in history. His visits meant a great deal to Catholics around the world. For him, one of the most important trips was to the Holy Land in March 2000. Our religious affairs correspondent, Robert Piggott, explains why.
It was a dream fulfilled. For the first time as Pope, John Paul II arrived in the Holy Land to retrace the steps of Christ. But, welcomed in Jerusalem by Israel's then Prime Minister Ehud Barak, he was about to tread a political and religious minefield. A military helicopter took the Pope the next day to Bethlehem, the place where Jesus was born and now predominantly a Palestinian territory. Palestinians were delighted that he kissed the soil, a sign for them he recognized their nationhood. Yasser Arafat and many other Muslims attended a mass in Manger Square. Later, the Pope went with Arafat to a refugee camp, confirming his sympathy for the Palestinian cause. But Jewish anxiety was dispelled the following day as John Paul II became the first Pope ever to enter the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial. One survivor of the death camps greeted him in tears.
Mrs. Edith Zierer, born in Poland. After the war, she was found by a young priest who carried her to the train station to join other survivors. This priest later became the Pope, John Paul II.
The Pope said he was deeply saddened by the persecution of Jews, but some Israelis wanted him to go further, to apologize for the Church's failure during the war to do more to stop Jews being murdered. The rest of his visit focused on the roots of Christianity. In a youth mass in Galilee, 2,000 years after Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, the Pope gave his own version.
Blessed are you who seem to be losers, because you are the true winners. You are the true winners. The kingdom of heaven is yours.
Many Christians were overwhelmed by the occasion. Later, the Pope went to Nazareth and visited the basilica where Christians say the angel Gabriel told Mary she was to give birth to a son. The Pope then prayed at the place where Jesus prayed before the crucifixion. It was a historic visit, and with his strong defence of human rights, Pope John Paul won friends on both sides of the religious divide.
Well, tributes to the Pope have been flooding into the BBC's website. Our correspondent Matthew Charles has been reading what you've written. Matthew, give us a flavour of what has been coming into you there.
That's right, hundreds of emails are coming into us here at the BBC from across the country and around the globe. Joanne in Liverpool says, I heard His Holiness say Mass at Liverpool's Roman Catholic Cathedral in 1982. I was 15 years old and I remember it as if it were yesterday. He was a gift from God. We also have tributes coming in from the Pope's native Poland. Agnieszka says, I am so proud to be one of the Pope's countrymen, and I'll always try to keep him alive in my words, deeds, and in my heart. But these tributes also showing that the Pope's legacy transcended religions. Dina Nasser in Cairo in Egypt says, Pope John Paul II was an amazing man. If only our world leaders would look up to him and learn a thing or two about compassion. As a Muslim, I'll be praying for him. Scott in America says Pope John Paul was a great world leader. We can only pray that the current crop of leaders around the world look to his example and practice tolerance and love instead of bigotry. So lots of emails coming into us there at the BBC, an example of the Pope's lasting legacy.
Well, Matthew, as we speak to you, we can see pictures coming in live from St. Peter's Square, where tens of thousands have gathered, and where you are. The internet is very much a place where people around the world can communicate their feelings.
That's right. As these emails are showing, there are literally hundreds of tributes coming in from across the globe, and a symbol perhaps of the openness of the Vatican, of this Pope's reign. He was very open. He was known for his openness. He didn't remain inside the Vatican. He opened the Catholic Church up to the people who practice it. And I think these emails are a sign of that today.
And evidence of his ability to appeal to people across the boundaries, people of all faiths contacting BBC Online.
That's right. We have emails coming in from the Islamic world. As I said to you here, we had Dina Nasser, who is in Egypt, who said, as a Muslim, I pray for him. So evidence, yes, that the Pope's legacy did transcend religious borders as well as political ones.
Matthew, thank you.
We stay in St. Peter's Square. It's just coming up to 1 o'clock in the morning in Italy, 3 hours and 20 minutes after the death of Pope John Paul II. There are still tens of thousands in St. Peter's Square, and I guess they will remain there, many of them, through until the funeral later in the week. Another email that we've received here from a Polish electrician who says, I have work waiting for me in Poland, but I think I'll be going to Rome. He says, I can't explain it. I've never met him, but he is someone who simply radiates a force. There has never been such a Pole as him, and there never will be. And from Portugal, somebody saying he was a saint. He'll stay in everyone's hearts. He was always a fighter up until the hour of his death. He is at peace. And look at those faces in St. Peter's Square. Those people who've come from all over Italy and from far beyond, just to be there at the moment that Pope John Paul II died. The bells in the Vatican tolling. Words not necessary.
We've learned from the Vatican tonight that the Pope's final hours were marked by uninterrupted prayer. Let's join Brian Hanrahan now in Vatican City.
This is a BBC News special. I'm Brian Hanrahan in Rome. Pope John Paul II has died there have been many people gathering to mourn him in St. Peter's Square, where an announcement of his death was made a little over 3 hours ago.
Dear brothers and sisters, at 21:37, our much beloved Holy Father John Paul II returned to the home of his father, and we pray for him.
The pontiff had been ill for some time, first with Parkinson's disease, but in recent weeks he began suffering breathing problems. Across Rome, bells have been tolling to signal the Pope's death, and Italy has declared 3 days of national mourning. The leader of the Roman Catholic Church, John Paul II, has died here in Rome. He was 84. We are getting a statement from the Pope's personal spokesman, Dr. Navarro Valls, at this moment.
On February the 22nd, 1996, had been activated. Il Santo Padre Giovanni Paolo II è deceduto questa sera alle 21:37 nel suo appartamento privato. Alle ore 20 era cominciata la celebrazione della Santa Messa, nel corso della quale è stata amministrato al Santo Padre il Santo Viatico e ancora una volta l'unzione degli infermi.
All the procedures were activated which are envisaged by the apostolic procedure, which is promulgated by John Paul II on the 22nd of February of 1996.
That was a brief statement from Dr. Navarro Valls, repeating very much what was issued in written form a few hours ago when the first news of the announcement was made. It's been a day in which the Vatican has been preparing the way for the Pope's death. We know that he had heart and kidney failure over the last 24 hours. Then today they announced that he had had a high fever. And at that point, the cardinals who visited him began to talk openly of his death within the next few hours. It has been a remarkably open death in which the Vatican has clearly been determined that everybody should know what was happening and there should be none of the confusion and the suspicions that have shrouded papal deaths in the past. In that, it had the stamp of John Paul II himself, a man who's changed this church while he's been its leader. Gavin Hewitt reports on today's events here in Rome.
It had been the announcement that Rome had long expected.
Carissimi fratelli e sorelle, alle 21:37 il nostro amatissimo.
Dearest brothers and sisters, at 9:27, our beloved Holy Father, John Paul II, returned to the house of our Father. At first, the crowd in St. Peter's Square was silent as it took in Archbishop Sandri's words. Then many broke down in tears as the Vatican's funeral bell was rung. During the day, they had been chanting the Pope's name, willing him to defy his failing health. Now, some stood with heads bowed, while others sang hymns. One man kissed a picture of the Pope he was holding. There was real affection here for a leader who had traveled more than any other pope and had fought illness for so long. Many said that this man of strong, unbending faith had been an inspiration.
He was instrumental in my deciding to become a priest and has been an inspiration for me throughout my priesthood. His courage, his tenacity, his evangelical nature that continued to inspire me and continues to inspire the world.
So many mixed emotions, so sad, so somber, but so happy he's called home. It sounds like he was ready
Sure, I know. A couple weeks ago he said he had abandoned himself to God's will, and for someone to have that strength and that courage, and that he was at peace with his situation right now. So I think that's how we all can feel.
Exactly, and it sounds like he was still coherent and lucid, up to the final moments of his life, and that's to be able to, pass on with such dignity. That's how he lived his whole life.
In the square, there were people from the Pope's native Poland who remembered his part in ending communism in Eastern Europe.
But I think that we are proud that a Pope was Polish, and that it was a huge man for all church, really.
An archbishop told the crowd, "We all feel like orphans this evening." And it was immediately apparent that there'll be a huge outpouring of grief for the man who led the Catholic Church for 26 years. As soon as the Pope's death was announced, people began streaming here to St. Peter's Square, and they're still arriving now. Many of them were in tears, but many of them also spoke warmly about the Pope's struggle over the last few days, saying they were among the most impressive days of his papacy, living out his message that there can be serenity even in the heart of suffering. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News at the Vatican.
Now, it was from Poland that the Pope came to take up his office. It is there that we go first this evening to Tristana Moore, who's in Krakow, where he was the Cardinal Archbishop when he was elected as Pope. Tristana, what's the feeling there? How are they taking the news?
Well, there is still a sense of shock here, and hundreds and thousands of people are still gathering outside the Archbishop's residence here, looking up at the window where the Pope used to appear to meet the crowds when he used to come here on previous visits. And the churches nearby are all full. There are special masses going on, and people wandering around the streets, holding candles, bringing flowers to the Archbishop's residence, and crying. When you ask them about their reactions, many are lost for words. I mean, this is a very emotional time for Poles, especially here in the city, in Krakow. This was where the Pope spent 4 decades of his adult life. It was here in this city that he studied at a seminary secretly under Nazi occupation. He was ordained as a priest here in Krakow, and he later became the Archbishop and Cardinal. So the people of this city have a very close bond with the Pope.
And presumably there are still strong memories of him. There are people there, even though he's been in the Vatican for 25 years, who remember him, who know what he was like as a man.
Yes, a lot of people have personal memories. They remember the time, even as far back as 1979, when the Pope came here. John Paul was just elected to the papacy then, and he made his first trip back to Poland, really inspiring many Poles at the time, giving them strength and hope, telling them not to be afraid. And it is really those feelings of courage and hope and strength that many Poles still feel now. They have said tonight they have lost their father.
And President Kwasniewski has been speaking about his role in what he's making clear is the liberation of Poland. He says Poland became free because of the Pope's influence.
Yes, and that is a message really that many Poles still believe, that the Pope did play a crucial role in at least helping to bring about the end of communism here, inspiring Polish people, telling them not to be afraid, to be fearless, and to really fill them with hope that they could conduct this transition from communism to democracy. And even for the younger generation who didn't know, the people who had never met the Pope at all but just saw him on television when he was globe-trotting, they have very, very personal memories, and they also feel that the Pope meant something special to them as well.
Tristana Moore in Krakow, thank you very much for joining us this evening. This has been an epic papacy in just about every way. It's not just the length of time that he's sat here in the Vatican directing the affairs of the Catholic Church. It's the range of subjects over which he has spread his influence in terms of religion, in terms of politics, in terms of faith, in terms of morals. He's had an enormous influence on the world as well as on his own adherents. Nicholas Witchell looks back at the reign of the Pope.
Habemus Papam.
October 1978. From a balcony at the Vatican, a new name was thrust onto the world stage. Karol Józef Wojtyła from Poland, the first non-Italian pope for 400 years, and at 58, the youngest for a century. His choice was a break with the past, but in this charismatic but uncompromising cardinal from Krakow, the Catholic Church had elected a pope who was prepared to travel the world and preach the toughest of messages. His mission was clear-cut, to reverse years of liberal drift. So Pope John Paul II said a decisive no to contraception, abortion, divorce, homosexuality, and married and female priests. But alongside that was a passionate yes to human rights and justice for the poor.
The poor people and poor nations will judge those people who take these goods away from them, amassing to themselves the imperialistic monopoly of economic and political supremacy at the expense of others.
Karol Wojtyła's early life had been hard. He grew up in the southern Polish village of Wadowice. The son of an army sergeant, his mother and brother died before he was 14. His upbringing was strict and devout. Then, before he was 20, war broke out. In 1939, German tanks crushed Poland's defences and the country was subjected to brutal occupation. Wojtyła was a student at Krakow University. Many of his friends were sent to concentration camps. He was hoping to become an actor and helped launch Poland's clandestine National Theatre. But 2 narrow escapes in road accidents strengthened his religious beliefs. Wojtyła was ordained amidst the ruins of post-war Poland as Soviet troops replaced German and Stalin sought to suppress religion. This is where Karol Wojtyła's model of Catholicism was forged. Confronted by a communist regime, it was the Catholic Church which kept alive the Polish national spirit, and it did so by holding fast to the traditional Catholic certainties. It was an experience he was never to forget. In 1958, the young priest with the towering intellect and popular touch had become Bishop of Krakow. He began a challenge to communism which would change history. Nowa Huta was meant to be a showcase communist city, a city without a church. But Wojtyła campaigned for 20 years for the right to build one. It was shaped like a ship, and it was to launch its captain on an unexpected voyage. In June 1979, 8 months after his election as Pope, he returned to his beloved Poland. It was the first time a Pope had visited a communist country, and 2 million Poles lined the streets of Warsaw to greet him. Pope John Paul had been warned that his growing influence might make him the target of an assassination attempt. In 1981, in St. Peter's Square, he was struck down by 2 bullets fired from close range. One shot was undoubtedly from the gun of a Turkish hired killer, Ali Agca, who was immediately arrested. An armed accomplice was photographed at the scene but never caught. The Pope had cheated death and remarkably offered his attacker forgiveness face to face. Back in Poland, he increased the pressure on the regime of General Jaruzelski and gave vital support to the shipyard strike leader Lech Wałęsa, later to become president of a democratic Poland. By 1989, communism was collapsing. President Gorbachev became the first Soviet leader to seek an audience with the Pope. In the struggle against communism, John Paul had won. For the most widely travelled pontiff in history, there were more distant continents to reach and new campaigns to wage. Africa was told the battle against AIDS could not justify condom use, just as abortion could never be right.
No one ever has the authority to destroy unborn life.
In Latin America, radical priests were berated for getting mixed up in left-wing politics, too close to the communism he'd devoted his life to defeating. In Ireland, as 1 million worshippers heard Mass at Drogheda, he pleaded for an end to paramilitary killings.
On my knees, I beg you to turn away from the path of violence and to return to the ways of peace.
A few years later, in 1982, he became the first pope to visit Great Britain. The trip coincided with the Falklands conflict. At Coventry, he addressed the biggest ever gathering of British Catholics and made clear his disapproval of the war.
Today, the scale and the horror of modern warfare, whether nuclear or not, makes it totally unacceptable.
Despite an historic encounter at Canterbury with its then Anglican Archbishop Robert Runcie, John Paul ruled out joint communion with a church which ordained women. Critics said the Roman Catholic Church was becoming dangerously out of touch. It dealt clumsily and ineffectively, in the view of many, with the growing scandal of paedophile priests and marginalised the modernisers who urged it to be more open. The Pope believed that it was the world which should conform to the Church to receive salvation.
The mission of salvation, that is the mission of the Church. And this mission is still actual, is still of today and of tomorrow.
As the new millennium dawned, there was inescapable evidence of John Paul's growing infirmity. But for a pope, as for a British monarch, the only release from duty is death. Despite his growing frailty, he continued to travel to the Holy Land in the year 2000, and 2 years later, an emotionally charged visit to his homeland of Poland. He'll be remembered as one of the most powerful popes of recent times, autocratic and charismatic, a natural leader whose warmth inspired millions in every continent. Yet a man so committed to the old Catholic certainties that he could dismiss other churches as defective and disregard the pain caused by his hardline policies. For all that, for more than a quarter of a century, he was one of the world's most revered figures. Karol Wojtyła, the Polish Pope John Paul II, mourned tonight by 1 billion Roman Catholics and by many others.
And there have been many tributes pouring into the Polish Pope from all around the world. Some of them from Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary-General, from Shimon Peres of Israel, from Lech Wałęsa, the former Solidarity leader in Poland, from Margaret Thatcher, and from George Bush, who offered a firm tribute within minutes of hearing of the Pope's death.
The Catholic Church has lost its shepherd. The world has lost a champion of human freedom, and a good and faithful servant of God has been called home. Pope John Paul II left the throne of St. Peter in the same way he ascended to it, as a witness to the dignity of human life.
Now we're joined by Adam Brooks in Washington. An extraordinary tribute from a man with whom he'd often disagreed, he'd clashed violently over issues of politics.
Well, there were certainly disagreements between the Pope and George Bush. I mean, most recently, the question of the Iraq War comes to mind. This was something that the Pope appeared to be substantially opposed to. But underlying those disagreements, there were important commonalities, too, between Pope John Paul II and George Bush. And I think the Pope is going to be remembered here in the United States as instrumental in winning the Cold War and ending communism, but also as somebody who worked towards forging a sort of unity between American Catholics and American Protestants and evangelicals, who helped them to sort of establish religious conservatism over the last decade or two as a very important force in American politics, and a force which has played a major role in bringing George Bush to the presidency. And I think in that eulogy that we heard from George Bush, you heard allusions to these commonalities George Bush spoke of the Pope always urging his flock to build a culture of life. This refers to his opposition to abortion and to euthanasia. Important doctrinal aspects that he shares in common with conservative Christianity across America. So, yes, there were disagreements, but there were also important parallels in the way that the two men thought.
You touched there on the difficulties of unpicking the many strands, the complexities of this man's position. But I suppose what stands out there is the way in which he was so much more than just a religious leader, how he turned religious power, I suppose, into power in the world of politics.
And many here are pointing to John Paul's understanding of the communication age. That the way to channel his charisma, indeed to achieve that metamorphosis from personal charisma into political power, was to use the media and to make himself more publicly high profile than any other pope had ever been. And John Paul seemed intuitively to understand that. Now, America, of course, is a political culture where the media is immensely important and where the politics of personality is right at the forefront of public speech and action. And so John Paul's charisma, his ability to talk to the television camera, his amazing ability with languages, and this sort of charismatic common touch that he had, spoke to very well the way that politics works in America. And that, I think, contributed to the fact that his public profile was forged so greatly here.
Adam Brooks in Washington, thank you. Now, this is a pope who has seen the rise of Catholicism outside Europe, outside North America, and seen it spread and become a dominant part of the church now in the developing world. Latin America, Asia and Africa now make up most of the Catholics around the world. Emily Buchanan looks at his many travels to reach to people who before would never have seen a pope.
With double the number of Catholics in the developing world as in Europe, John Paul II devoted enormous energy to his visits to the poorest countries, despite declining health. He returned again and again to Latin America. There, the Catholic Church faced the challenge of many highly popular priests whom it suspected of being Marxist. To Pope John Paul, the idea of a priest-politician was abhorrent. During a visit to Nicaragua, he condemned the so-called liberation theology created by left-wing priests as a deviation.
John Paul II was very radical in his social outlook, if you look at his teaching, but was very conservative in his understanding of church and of his basic theology. The end result was that those theologians that were judged to have overstepped the mark were often brought to order.
One of those brought to order was the revolutionary Brazilian theologian Leonardo Boff. He was summoned to Rome and was eventually barred from teaching and writing. The antipathy between the Pope and communism delayed his visit to Cuba until late in his papacy. Accepting an invitation from Fidel Castro, the Pope was even-handed in his criticism of atheist Marxist states and of the excesses of capitalism. Castro was particularly pleased to hear the Pope attack the American trade embargo. Pope John Paul always seemed more at ease on his visits to Africa. Africa is the only area of the world where the number of priests is increasing. John Paul II knew that in the future there could be an African pope. The Pope worked hard for dialogue between faiths, but even so, relations were sometimes strained. In Sri Lanka, Buddhist monks were angry about comments on their faith made in a book by the Pope himself.
The Roman Catholic Church in the last 2 decades has found it very difficult to know how to deal with the other major world religions. I think there's a sense in which the Pope and the Catholic Church wanted to say that through the person of Jesus of Nazareth, through the Christ, you have the way of salvation.
But other churches offered a quicker path to salvation. Across South America, hundreds of thousands were tempted away from Catholicism by the lure of a Protestant god who promised the poor instant prosperity, and papal visits attempted to reverse the trend. Of his many visits to Asia, the most remarkable was when he celebrated Mass in the Philippines' capital, Manila. 1 million had been expected, 4 million turned out, making it the biggest papal Mass in history. The Pope's message: since his followers couldn't come to Rome, Rome would come to them.
Pope has always been a very human figure. We have two images of him. The man who, with his hand upraised, reaching out to the world in blessing as a young man, and then becoming old and enfeebled. His genius has been to remind us that we both have to live through those two phases of life. This is BBC News in Rome.
Pope John Paul II was the most travelled pontiff in history. His visits meant a great deal to Catholics around the world. For him, one of the most important trips was to the Holy Land in March 2000. Our religious affairs correspondent Robert Piggott explains why.
It was a dream fulfilled. For the first time as Pope, John Paul II arrived in the Holy Land to retrace the steps of Christ. But, welcomed in Jerusalem by Israel's then Prime Minister Ehud Barak, he was about to tread a political and religious minefield. A military helicopter took the Pope the next day to Bethlehem, the place where Jesus was born and now predominantly a Palestinian territory. Palestinians were delighted that he kissed the soil, a sign for them he recognized their nationhood. Yasser Arafat and many other Muslims attended a mass in Manger Square. Later, the Pope went with Arafat to a refugee camp, confirming his sympathy for the Palestinian cause. But Jewish anxiety was dispelled the following day as John Paul II became the first pope ever to enter the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial. One survivor of the death camps greeted him in tears.
Mrs. Edith Zierer, born in Poland, after the war she was found by a young priest who carried her to the train station to join other survivors. This priest later became the Pope, John Paul II.
The Pope said he was deeply saddened by the persecution of Jews, but some Israelis wanted him to go further, to apologize for the Church's failure during the war to do more to stop Jews being murdered. The rest of his visit focused on the roots of Christianity. In a youth mass in Galilee, 2,000 years after Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount, the Pope gave his own version.
Blessed are you who seem to be losers, because you are the true winners. You are the true winners. The kingdom of heaven is yours.
Many Christians were overwhelmed by the occasion. Later, the Pope went to Nazareth and visited the basilica where Christians say the angel Gabriel told Mary she was to give birth to a son. The Pope then prayed at the place where Jesus prayed before the crucifixion. It was a historic visit, and with his strong defence of human rights, Pope John Paul won friends on both sides of the religious divide.
In Rome tonight, the patient vigil continues, and there's no doubt that the quiet prayer and reflection of so many people will have been relayed to the Pope in his private apartments overlooking the vast St. Peter's Square. Among that vast crowd are pilgrims, worshippers and tourists, all of whom have their own reasons for being here, from devotion to simple curiosity.
It had been a long day of vigils in St. Peter's Square. Then this evening the announcement came that Rome had long expected. Cardinal Ruini spoke of the Pope and his first moments meeting with God. The Pope had died in his private apartment at 9:37. Even though his death had been long expected, many in the crowd broke down in tears. During the day they had been chanting his name, willing him to defy his failing health. Some just stood there with their heads bowed. Then, slowly, the crowd broke into a hymn. One man kissed a picture of the Pope he was holding. There was real affection here for a man who had travelled more than any other Pope and had fought illness for so long. Many said that this man of strong, unbending faith had been an inspiration to them.
He was instrumental in my deciding to become a priest and has been an inspiration for me throughout my priesthood. His courage, his tenacity, his evangelical nature that continued to inspire me and continues to inspire the world.
So many mixed emotions, so sad, so somber, but so happy he's called home. It
Peaceful.
Sounds like he was ready.
Sure, a couple weeks ago he said he had abandoned himself to God's will, and for someone to have that strength and that courage, and that he was at peace with his situation right now. So I think that's how we all can feel.
Exactly, and it sounds like he was still coherent and lucid, up to the final moments of his life, and that's to be able to, pass on with such dignity. That's how he lived his whole life.
It was immediately apparent that there will be a huge outpouring of grief for the man who led the Catholic Church for 26 years. As soon as the Pope's death was announced, people began streaming here to St. Peter's Square, and they're still arriving now. Many of them are in tears, but many of them also spoke warmly about the Pope's struggle over the last few days, saying they were among the most impressive days of his papacy, living out his message that there can be serenity even in the heart of suffering. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News at the Vatican.
And meanwhile, back in London, the Labour Party has announced it's suspending all public campaigning today, Sunday, as a mark of respect following the death of Pope John Paul II. This will include the cancellation of Gordon Brown's education speech, which should have been delivered later on today in Shipley in Yorkshire. So, just to recap on the news, the Pope has died. After struggling with poor health for so long, the Pope finally passed away at 23 minutes to 9 tonight. He was 84 years old. Tonight, the Queen expressed her deep sorrow at his death. Thousands crowded into St. Peter's Square outside the Pope's apartments. Our correspondent Ben Gagan reports on today's events in Rome.
All day they had gathered in their thousands in St. Peter's Square. They knew the end was close, that the man who had led their prayers in this place for so many years would never do so again.
Gloria Patri et Filio.
And then, as their candlelit vigil was underway, the news came in an email from his spokesman that Pope John Paul II had died at 23 minutes to 10 local time.
Dear brothers and sisters, at 21:37, our much beloved Holy Father John Paul II returned to the home of his father, and we pray for him.
The crowd, who'd been praying in the square since early evening, then applauded and went quiet. The moment had come. The Pope's suffering, which had been so public and had lasted so long, was over. The news was confirmed by the slow tolling of the cathedral bells across the Vatican City. The Italian government has announced 3 days of national mourning. Tonight, officials will start to empty the Pope's apartment in the Vatican, which will then be sealed. The gold ring of St. Peter will be taken off his finger and broken, all according to centuries-old tradition. The process of finding a successor will soon be underway. Ben Gagan, BBC News.
The leader of the Roman Catholic Church in England and Wales, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, appeared on the steps of Westminster Cathedral in central London shortly after the announcement to pay his tribute. Westminster Cathedral in London will remain open all night. Around the world, over 1 billion Catholics are now in mourning. Matthew Charles reports on international reactions.
The news, when it came, confirmed what pilgrims gathered in St. Peter's Square knew they would hear. There was silence, private thoughts, tears, but then also this. appreciation shown for a pope who's inspired and guided the thinking of the Church for more than 2.5 decades. Even to the end, he maintained a determination to discharge his duties to the Catholic community of 1 billion souls. The lights in his private apartment still burning. Tributes are flooding in from across the globe. In the United States, President Bush gave his reaction to the news.
The Catholic Church has lost its shepherd. The world has lost a champion of human freedom. And a good and faithful servant of God has been called home.
The leader of the Catholic Church in England and Wales also paid tribute.
We'll remember him for his endurance of suffering, even to the very end. And we'll remember him, and I think the whole world should remember him, for reminding us tirelessly that this world is not the only world, that there's a world to come, our eternal destiny.
Nowhere will the loss be felt more keenly than in his native Poland. He was Archbishop of Krakow before being appointed Pope, the first non-Italian in that position for more than 4 centuries.
We used to think about Pope as a member of the family, and it's always said if a person so close dies.
After days of medical bulletins charting the decline of the Pope's health, it is now time for those who'd gathered to support the Pontiff in his final moments to consider the future of a church without him. Matthew Charles, BBC News.
In recent weeks, the Pope's increasingly frail health had become more obvious. He was twice taken to hospital after suffering breathing problems, which left him unable to lead Easter celebrations for the first time in his papacy. Nick Hyam looks back at the Pope's final days.
Early in February, the Pope was rushed to Rome's Gemelli Hospital with breathing difficulties brought on by a throat infection. Catholics around the world prayed for his swift recovery.
Johannes Paulus, Papa Secundus.
10 days after being admitted, he thanked his medical team before returning to the Vatican. In his next address, the Pope spoke briefly, thanking those who'd prayed for his recovery. But the extent of his illness became apparent once more when just over a week later he appeared at his weekly audience via a video link. The next day he was on his way back to hospital for a second time, once more with breathing problems. As the world's media gathered outside, doctors performed a tracheotomy to ease his condition. After a stay of 2.5 weeks, the Pope was well enough to give the traditional Sunday greeting to pilgrims from the window of his hospital room. The same evening, he left the Gemelli Hospital once more for the Vatican. Seated in a people carrier, not his usual Pope-mobile, and surrounded by heavy security, John Paul waved to the crowds who lined the route back to St. Peter's Square. But during the Easter period, the Pope was often more notable for his absence than his presence at events. On Palm Sunday, he looked tired and drawn while blessing the gathered pilgrims. And at the traditional Good Friday ceremonies, he could be glimpsed only briefly on a video screen, after doctors decided he was too ill to attend in person. On Easter Sunday, for the first time in 26 years, the Pope was unable to give his traditional message, struggling but failing to speak, much to his obvious frustration. The thousands of pilgrims in St. Peter's Square were touched by his efforts. The following week, Pope John Paul appeared silently at the window of the papal apartments as his doctors announced that he was being fed through a tube inserted into his nose. Nick Hyam, BBC News.
Well, let's take you live to the Vatican now so we can see the scene where tens of thousands of people have been gathering there all day. The Pope died at 9:37 local time there in Italy. And across the world, reaction has been coming in. Our correspondent Clarence Mitchell has been at Westminster Cathedral, where the Catholic community have been gathering too.
Well, within minutes of the news of the Pope's death being confirmed in Rome, the Westminster Cathedral here in the heart of London was ringing a bell. A bell was tolling from the cathedral's great tower to pass that sad, sombre news on to Catholics across the Diocese of Westminster, of course, but to the Catholic community far beyond it across Britain. The papal flag was also raised to half-mast, and the Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, himself came out and spoke very briefly to reporters to say that the world had lost one of its great leaders, and he paid tribute to his witness, to courage, to freedom, and to the dignity of human life. He said that the world would miss him, the Church would miss him, and he himself would miss the Pope, given that he had led such a wonderful and extraordinary life. People, of course, have been coming here to the cathedral throughout the day, many hundreds of Catholics and indeed Christians as well as people of other faith, all coming to pray for the Pope. That has continued with the news of his death. Many hundreds coming into the cathedral still into the early hours of the morning to pray, some lighting candles before a picture of him at the altar, many in quiet solitude saying their own prayers and in silence, some of them in tears. The cathedral will be open all night to allow people to come in to express their sorrow, to pray, and in many ways to celebrate the Pope's life. Before, of course, later on Sunday morning, a full Requiem Mass is held here. That will be attended by probably some 1,200 people, it's expected. It'll be an immensely moving occasion. And then on Monday afternoon, Vespers for the Dead, prayers for the Pope will be said at a special service attended by many VIPs. Many politicians will be here. Up to 400 VIPs are expected. And then finally on Tuesday or perhaps Wednesday, the Cardinal himself will be flying to Rome to take part, of course, in the funeral.